Where's Beacon? I said, where is Beacon? Tell me now or you're all dead!
The trauma bay at Mercy General was loud the way it always was on a Friday night, monitors beeping gurneys, scraping someone down the hall, calling for backup. Audra Keegan was in the corner restocking supply carts. Float nurse. Invisible by design. Then the windows rattled not from thunder, but from rotor blades multiple and closing fast. The doors burst open, and 6 men in tactical gear flooded the bay, carrying a soldier whose left leg ended just below the knee lips, already turning blue. The doctors froze. The charge nurse pressed flat against the wall. And the man in front, jaw, locked eyes cutting across every face in the room, shouted above the chaos, "Where's Beacon?" No one answered. No one knew what the word meant. But Audra Keegan set down her supply cart and stepped out of the corner she had spent 2 years hiding in. If you've never heard a story like this before, stay with me. And if this is your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button. Every week I bring you stories about the people nobody sees coming. 3 hours before the helicopters came, Audra Keegan was doing what she always did on a Friday night shift, moving quietly through the edges of the trauma bay, refilling glove dispensers and restocking the supply cart. Nobody else wanted to touch. It was the kind of work that kept her hands busy and her name out of conversations. At Mercy General Float, nurses didn't belong to any unit. They filled gaps, absorbed the tasks nobody claimed, and disappeared at the end of their shift. Without anyone noticing, they had gone. Audra had understood that arrangement the moment she took the job, and she had been grateful for it ever since. Marlene Baird ran the trauma floor, the way some people ran church, with absolute conviction that her way was the only way, and that anyone who questioned it was committing something close to sin. She was a charge nurse with 2 decades of experience and a habit of drawing invisible lines between her permanent staff and everyone else. Float nurses in Marlene's professional taxonomy were somewhere below residents and somewhere above the janitorial crew, useful for exactly 3 things: vital signs, waste disposal, and staying out of the way. She had made this clear to Audra on her first shift, and she made it clear again periodically, the way someone might remind a house guest not to use the good towels. Audra had never argued. She measured blood pressures, wheeled out biohazard bags, and kept her head down with a consistency that Marlene probably mistook for deference. It wasn't. It was something much older and more deliberate, a behavior she had spent 2 years carefully constructing since the day she signed her discharge papers and decided that the version of herself the Army had built was no longer something she wanted to carry in public. She had been a combat medic for 6 years. The call sign Beacon came from the early days of her second deployment, when she developed a reputation for finding her way to the wounded, in conditions where no one else could orient themselves, through smoke, through structure, collapse, through the specific kind of darkness that exists when a mission has already gone badly wrong. By the time she reached the rank that gave her command of a medical element, her unit called her Echo 6 in the official channels and Beacon everywhere else. She had made decisions in the field that no textbook prepared a person to make, the kind where there were no good options, and the least terrible one still cost something that couldn't be returned. The last deployment ended on a mountain in northern Afghanistan, at an elevation where the air was thin enough to make every movement feel like death. They lost 3 people that night, not because anyone made the wrong call, not because the equipment failed, not because she wasn't fast enough. They lost 3 people because sometimes that is what happens, and the military does not provide a satisfying explanation beyond that fact. She came home with a left knee that had been reconstructed well enough to walk on, but not well enough to forget. And a collection of memories that she had learned to manage the way you manage a chronic condition, not cured, not gone, just handled hour by hour, day by day. The job at Mercy General was not a step down in her own accounting. It was a choice. It was smaller, quieter, and it required nothing of her that she wasn't willing to give on any given day. She could set the terms. She could leave at the end of a shift. Nobody was asking her to be the last line between a living person and a body bag, or so she told herself on most days convincingly enough. That particular Friday had run the way most Fridays ran: a laceration in Bay 2, a cardiac event, that turned out to be anxiety in Bay 4, a child with a broken wrist who cried more from fear than pain and was ultimately charmed into calm by one of the pediatric nurses. Audra moved through the periphery of all of it, neither invited in nor asking to be. She had just finished logging a supply restock when she heard the curtain pull back in Bay 7 and caught the edge of Colin Dorsey's voice going up half a register in a way that meant something was wrong. Colin was a second-year resident, technically competent, visibly young, with the kind of nervous energy that expressed itself in excess movement. He was good at medicine in the way that students are good at exams, which is not always the same thing as being good at the moment, directly in front of you. The patient in Bay 7 was an older man with a fractured pelvis and a blood pressure reading that had dropped far enough fast enough to qualify as a problem. Colin had tried twice for IV access and missed both times, and the monitor was making a sound that suggested there was not a lot of time left to try a third. Audra set down her clipboard. She was aware of the specific sensations that preceded this kind of intervention. Not adrenaline exactly, more like the moment before you step off a curb, the fraction of a second, when the decision is already made but the body hasn't committed yet. She told herself she was just going to stand closer. That was all. Just be nearby. She was at the bedside before she had finished the thought. She asked Colin quietly enough not to draw attention from where he had tried, and he showed her. She selected a smaller gauge needle from the tray, found the vein she wanted by feel rather than sight, and placed the line cleanly on the first attempt. The relief on Colin's face was immediate and unguarded, the kind of expression that hadn't yet learned to hide itself. Then Audra put her hand on the patient's abdomen gently, just for a moment, and felt the rigidity under his skin that had no business being there. His belly is hard, she told Colin low and even. With that fracture and this pressure drop, you're probably looking at internal bleeding. He needs imaging before anything else moves forward. Colin looked at her the way people look at someone who has said something too accurate too quickly, with a combination of gratitude and suspicion about how they knew. Audra had already stepped back. She returned to her clipboard, noted the supply restock, and moved on without waiting to be thanked, because being thanked meant being remembered, and being remembered was not part of the arrangement. She was at the supply cart near the ambulance bay entrance when the feeling came. It started in the soles of her feet, a vibration deep and rhythmic, the kind that travels through concrete and steel before it ever reaches the air as sound. Most people would have registered it as distant thunder. Audra knew the difference between thunder and rotor blades by the time she was 3 deployments in, and she knew the difference between one aircraft and several. She counted the rhythm instinctively, the way she had learned to count everything in the field, not from anxiety, but from habit, because information was the one resource that never ran out. 3. At least 3 Black Hawks. Low altitude, fast approach, converging. She set the box of gloves down on the cart, with the same measured movement she used for everything, and she stood very still and she waited. The windows of the ambulance bay rattled first. Then the overhead fluorescents flickered, not a power issue, just the pressure wave rolling through the building as the aircraft came in low over the parking structure. Outside, she could hear the characteristic pitch change as they came into a hover, then the descending whine of rotors slowing for landing. The staff around her registered the sound as unusual. Audra registered it as an event type she recognized, and with recognition came a very specific and unwelcome understanding of what was likely to come through the doors next. She moved back toward the wall. Not fleeing, just repositioning, clearing the center of the room, the way you clear a landing zone, putting herself somewhere she could see everything without being immediately visible. The nurses at the station were already looking at each other. Marlene was on the phone, her voice sharpening into the particular register she used when she was being told something she didn't like. The doors opened hard. 6 men came through in the kind of formation that doesn't happen in civilian spaces, not aggressive exactly, but occupying the room in a way that communicated a complete disregard for the protocols posted on the wall beside the entrance. They were in tactical gear weapons, secured and pointed down, moving with the efficient urgency of people who had already done their risk assessment before they arrived. 2 of them were carrying a litter between them. The man on the litter had a tourniquet on his left leg, just above where the leg stopped existing, and the color had drained from his face the way color drains when the body is making hard decisions about where to send what little blood remains. The man at the front of the group was broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that doesn't show much, but communicates a great deal anyway. He swept the trauma bay in a single look, cataloging every person in the room, with the rapid assessment of someone who has learned to decide very quickly who in a given space is going to be useful. His gaze moved from the residents to the nurses to the attending who had appeared from the back hallway, and then he said the name, not a name, a call sign with the volume and clarity of a man who was done with preamble. "Where's Beacon?" The trauma bay went quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when something happens that doesn't fit into any existing category. The residents looked at each other. Marlene's phone hand dropped slightly. The attending took a step forward and started to say something about protocols, and the man at the front of the group looked at him with an expression that ended that sentence before it finished forming. Nobody answered. Nobody knew what the word meant or who it belonged to. Audra was standing against the wall with her clipboard in her hands and her supply cart to her left. She could feel the exact shape of the choice in front of her, the same way she had felt the vibration in her feet before the helicopters appeared as a physical fact arriving before she was ready for it. She had built 2 years of ordinary life on the assumption that the person those men were looking for no longer existed, or at least no longer existed here in this building, in this set of scrubs with this name on the badge. The man on the litter, Carter, she would learn his name later, but she already knew his type, knew the way combat casualties looked different from accident casualties. Something in the muscle tension, in the particular economy of someone who had been trained not to show how bad it was. Carter's body began the small, involuntary movements that precede loss of consciousness. His oxygen-starved heart was doing what oxygen-starved hearts do. Audra set her clipboard on the supply cart. She walked out from the wall. She crossed the center of the trauma bay and stopped in front of the man with the wide shoulders and the flat expression, and she looked up at him and she said it the way she used to say it when a situation had been assessed and a decision had been made, and there was no longer any reason to wait. Move. Rhett Bannon, because that was his name, and she had known it the moment she saw his face let out a breath that was not quite relief and not quite surprise. It was the breath of a man who had been right about something he very much needed to be right about. He stepped aside. His team stepped aside with him automatically, the way teams do when someone with authority enters the space. Behind her, the trauma bay was still catching up. Marlene had not yet decided what to do. The attending had not yet decided what to say. Colin Dorsey, who had watched Audra place a line he couldn't find and identify bleeding he had missed, was watching her again with an expression that had passed through confusion and was approaching something else entirely. None of that was Audra's concern right now. She was already at the litter, already running her hands down the sides of Carter's chest, already reading the tracheal deviation and the absent breath sounds on the left, and the distended veins at his neck that confirmed what the clinical picture had suggested from across the room. She knew what needed to happen. She had done it in the field with worse equipment and less light, and the specific additional complexity of someone trying to shoot at her while she did it. "I need a large-bore needle," she said to the room to whoever was listening. 14 gauge and a chest tube kit, right now. Marlene Baird had spent 20 years building a trauma floor that ran according to her rules, and those rules existed for reasons she could explain in detail to anyone who asked. So when a float nurse she had assigned to supply restocking demanded a chest tube kit in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, Marlene's first instinct was not to reach for the cabinet. Her first instinct was to establish clearly and immediately that this was not how things worked here. "You don't have the authority to order a procedure," Marlene said. Her voice carried the specific flatness of someone who has delivered this category of correction many times and expects it to land the same way it always has. Audra didn't look up from Carter's chest. She had 2 fingers pressed against his neck, reading the pulse with the concentration of someone extracting information from a source that was running low. When she spoke, she didn't raise her voice, which somehow made it more difficult to ignore than if she had. "Look at the monitor," Audra said. "Count how many seconds he has before his heart stops. Then decide whether your authority is the most important thing in this room right now." The monitor answered for her. The rhythm had gone from irregular to something that wasn't really a rhythm at all. Desmond Kearns, the attending, who had come from the back hallway and positioned himself at the edge of the bay with the expression of a man building a legal argument in real time, looked at the screen and then looked at Carter and then looked at Audra in a way that suggested his legal argument was losing structural integrity. Marlene opened the supply cabinet and pulled out the chest tube kit. She set it on the tray beside the bed with more force than was necessary, which was the closest she was going to get to a protest, and Audra accepted it without comment. Before she could reach for the needle, one of Rhett's soldiers had it ready, 14 gauge already in hand, passed across the litter with the economy of motion that comes from doing this kind of work in spaces where extra movement costs something. Audra took it without breaking her focus. The kit from Marlene, the needle from the team, 2 different sources for 2 different needs, and she used both. Colin Dorsey stood on the far side of the bay, with his hands at his sides, watching the exchange. He seemed to register for the first time that there was a different kind of medicine being practiced here than the kind he had learned in lecture halls. Audra located the second intercostal space by touch, angled the needle correctly, and drove it in. The release was immediate, a rush of trapped air that confirmed what the clinical picture had already told her. Carter's oxygen saturation began its climb back from the edge. The color at his lips didn't return, but it shifted, which was progress, which was enough for right now. "That buys him minutes," she said. "Not more. I need to place a chest tube or the pressure rebuilds and we're back where we started." Desmond opened his mouth and Audra continued without acknowledging him. "I know what you're going to say. Liability, protocol, infection risk. I've heard all of it and I understand all of it, and Carter will be in cardiac arrest before you finish explaining it to me. So either assist or step back." It was not a speech designed to win an argument. It was a statement of facts organized in the order that mattered. Desmond stepped back, not in retreat exactly, but in the way of someone who has made a decision and is choosing the form in which to make it. A moment later, he stepped forward again, this time to the supply tray, and began arranging instruments with the quiet competence of a man who had, under all the administrative reflex, actually trained for moments like this. Audra rocked her weight onto her right foot. The left knee had been signaling its objections for the past several minutes, a deep grinding ache that lived just below the level of threshold, the kind that would demand full attention the moment she stopped having something more important to focus on. She had learned to budget the pain, to store it somewhere she could collect it later, and she drew on that habit, now adjusting her stance so that the tremor in her knee didn't travel up into her hands. She had done this before on worse surfaces at higher altitude with less equipment and more noise, and her hands had been steady then, and they would be steady now. She made the incision along the fifth intercostal space, opened the tissue layer by layer, with the blunt dissection she had learned to do by feel in conditions where looking wasn't always possible. One of the nurses on Marlene's permanent staff made a sound and looked away. The soldiers didn't move. Rhett stood at a distance that was close enough to respond, and far enough not to crowd her, the distance of someone who had worked alongside her before and knew that she operated best when people trusted her to operate. The tube went in. Blood and air evacuated into the collection chamber, and Carter's chest expanded for the first time since he had come through the doors. His oxygen saturation climbed past 80, then past 90. His heart rate steadied. The monitors stopped their argument and settled into something that resembled a sustainable rhythm, and the trauma bay exhaled a breath that no one had realized it was holding. Colin Dorsey was looking at the vital signs display with the expression of someone running a quiet internal correction on an assumption he hadn't known he was making. "Get him to the OR," Audra said. "He needs vascular surgery on that leg, and there's still blood in the chest cavity. Tell them what they're looking at before he comes through the door." She stepped back from the litter as the transport team moved in, and she watched them take Carter through the bay doors with the specific attention of someone making sure the handoff was complete before she allowed herself to stop. The moment Carter was gone, her left knee informed her that it was done being patient. She found the instrument processing room by memory. She had cleaned it enough times to know the layout without looking. She turned the water to hot and stood at the sink and worked the blood from her hands, with the methodical attention she always gave to this particular task, not because it required concentration, but because it had been her way of marking the end of something since her second year in the field. Wash your hands. Let the water run. Move from what happened to what comes next. It wasn't working as well tonight as it usually did. The heat on her skin was doing something it occasionally did, pulling her backward, rather than forward, past Mercy General, and past the discharge processing office, and all the way back to a mountainside where the cold had been specific, and the dark had been complete, and she had washed her hands afterward in meltwater, and told herself the same thing she always told herself: you did what could be done. She was gripping the edge of the sink when she heard someone come in. Rhett Bannon closed the door behind him and stood a few feet back, giving her the room he had always given her when a situation had ended and the body needed a moment to understand that. He didn't fill the space with words immediately. When he spoke, he said the thing that mattered most first. "Carter's going to make it," Rhett said. "Surgeon says the leg's clean. Chest tube bought him exactly what he needed." Audra turned off the water. She reached for the paper towels. "Good," she said, which was all there was to say about that. Rhett let the silence hold for a moment before he continued. He told her what she had already partially understood, that they had violated regulations to land here, that the nearest trauma center equipped for penetrating chest trauma was 40 minutes by air, and that Carter hadn't had 40 minutes. He also told her the thing she hadn't known, that one of his team members, a soldier named Davis, who had taken a fragment round to the upper chest on a joint operation 3 years ago, had followed her career since the day she mustered out, because people who have been kept alive tend to track the people who kept them. Davis had known she was here. Rhett had made the call. "You used me," Audra said. The temperature in her voice was not anger. It was something more considered than anger. "I used the fact that you were here," Rhett said. "There's a difference. You made the choice. Nobody dragged you out of that corner." Audra set the paper towels down. The knee was a steady, dull presence now, something she would need to ice before she drove home. She thought about the corner she had been standing in, when the doors opened, about how precisely she had calculated the distance from the supply cart to the wall, about the 2 years of careful, deliberate invisibility that had ended in approximately 4 minutes of Carter Duvall's chest making sounds it shouldn't make. "I'm not Echo 6, she said. "I haven't been for 2 years. I have a float contract and a parking pass, and I restock glove dispensers. That's what I am here." Rhett looked at her with the direct, undecorated attention of someone who is not going to pretend they didn't see what they just saw. "You can call yourself whatever you want," he said. "You were Beacon the second you walked out from that wall. I don't think the name is the part you're actually arguing about." He didn't press further. He reached into the chest pocket of his jacket and set something on the edge of the sink, her unit badge, the one she had mailed back with the rest of her gear on the last day of outprocessing, or believed she had. It was dented at one corner, and there was a rust-colored stain along the bottom edge that was not rust. He left without making it into more than it was. The badge sat beside the faucet in the fluorescent light of the instrument room, and Audra looked at it for a long moment before she turned away and went back to the trauma floor. The bay had been partially cleaned. The litter was gone. The tray of instruments had been moved to the processing area. What remained was the particular aftermath of a large event that has passed things slightly out of place, a smell that would need the ventilation system to handle people standing in approximately the positions they had been in when the event ended, not yet sure what to do with their hands. Marlene was at the nursing station. Colin was writing something. Desmond was leaning against the wall with his arms folded and the expression of a man who is revising a longer document inside his head. The night staff, who had witnessed everything from various distances, were doing the thing people do when they need to look busy, but are actually watching, looking at charts, looking at monitors, not looking at Audra specifically, in a way that was its own form of looking at her. Nobody said anything when she walked back in. The silence was not hostile. It was the silence of a room that has been rearranged and hasn't yet figured out how to describe itself. Marlene set down her phone. She didn't look at Audra with the expression she usually used, that efficient categorizing glance that sorted people into their assigned positions, and moved on. She looked at Audra's hands instead, then at her face, and the expression that crossed her features was not apology and not admiration. It was something more uncomfortable than either the specific disorientation of someone who has been organizing the world a particular way for a long time and has just encountered evidence that the organizing principle was wrong. Desmond was the one who spoke. "Administration wants to meet," he said. "Tonight, if possible. There are questions about the procedure, the authorization, the military involvement." He said it the way he might report a lab result. "Here is the information, here are the implications. You may draw your own conclusions about what happens next." Audra understood what the meeting meant. It meant forms and reviews and conversations about scope of practice and incident reports that would sit in a file with her name on it. It meant questions she would have to answer about who she was before she came here, questions she had spent 2 years not being asked. The anonymous, uncomplicated life she had built at Mercy General, the parking pass and the float contract, and the supply carts that nobody else wanted to touch, had a weight she hadn't fully measured until this moment, standing in the middle of the trauma bay with everyone looking at her from the corners of their eyes. She'd spent 2 years becoming invisible. It had taken Carter Duvall approximately 4 minutes to make that impossible. She didn't run. She didn't calculate an exit. She stood in the center of the bay under the fluorescent lights and understood that the corner she had been standing in when this started no longer existed as a place she could return to. What came next, she didn't know yet. But she was done pretending there was still a corner to stand in. The administration building at Mercy General was connected to the main hospital by a corridor that always felt slightly colder than everywhere else, the kind of cold that had less to do with the HVAC system and more to do with the particular atmosphere of rooms where institutional decisions got made. Audra had walked this corridor twice before, once when she signed her float contract, once when she renewed it. Both times she had been alone, and both times she had been exactly what the paperwork said. She was a temporary employee, filling a gap unremarkable in every direction. Tonight, she walked it with Desmond Kearns slightly ahead of her, and Colin Dorsey slightly behind, which was not an arrangement she had planned or requested. Desmond had appeared at the trauma bay entrance and said simply that he was going to the meeting. Colin had closed his notebook and followed without being asked. Neither of them had explained their reasoning to Audra, and she hadn't asked because she understood that some things don't need to be explained to be understood. The conference room had 3 people from hospital administration already seated along with a risk management coordinator. The room had the feeling of a space that had been arranged in advance, which meant the questions had also been arranged in advance. The first question was about authorization. The second was about scope of practice. The third was about the military personnel and what exactly the hospital's liability exposure looked like, given that a non-credentialed staff member had performed a surgical procedure. Audra sat with her hands flat on the table and let the questions finish before she said anything, because she had learned in the field that the first person to speak in a tense room usually speaks from the wrong position. Before she could answer, Desmond set his forearms on the table and leaned forward with the specific energy of a man who has been building toward something and has decided this is the moment. "I was the attending physician on duty," he said. "Every clinical decision made in that bay tonight was made under my supervision. The patient presented with tension pneumothorax and hemorrhagic shock secondary to traumatic amputation. The time to deterioration was measured in minutes, not hours. What was done was the correct intervention, performed correctly, and the patient is currently in stable condition in the OR." He said this with the precision of someone who has learned that facts stated clearly and in the right order are more effective than arguments. "If there is a question of liability, I will answer it. But I will answer it as the physician who made the call, because that is what I am." Colin opened his notebook. He had documented everything the time Carter came through the doors, the initial presentation, each clinical decision, and its corresponding vital sign data, the response time between intervention and stabilization. He set the notebook on the table and slid it toward the administrator without comment. It was the kind of record that a second-year resident produces when he has understood that what he witnessed needs to exist somewhere beyond memory, organized in a form that anyone could read and follow. The administrator looked at the notebook, and then at Colin, and then at the notebook again. Then Marlene Baird, who had been sitting at the far end of the table and had not yet spoken, reached into the folder she had carried in and withdrew a set of documents. She set them on the table and pushed them toward the administrator quietly, without eye contact with Audra, without any of the presentation language that might have made the gesture feel performed. The documents were Audra's military medical records and training certifications. When Audra had signed her float contract 2 years ago, HR had required a full credentials package as standard procedure for anyone with prior medical training. Marlene had gone back to that file in the time between Carter going to the OR and this meeting beginning. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't announced what she was doing. She had simply retrieved what existed and put it where it needed to be. There was no apology in Marlene's face when she finally looked at Audra across the table. Audra didn't need one. She needed exactly what Marlene had put on the table, and that was what Marlene had put on the table. The acknowledgement of a person who has run an organizing principle into a wall and has chosen without ceremony to help clear the rubble. The meeting ended 30 minutes later without resolution and without further escalation, which in administrative terms meant it had gone reasonably well. Audra walked back through the cold corridor alone, and this time the walk felt different, not lighter exactly, but more honest. Like a distance she was covering as herself rather than as a version of herself she had edited for the environment. The trauma bay was quieter by the time she returned. The night had continued in the way nights at Mercy General always continued. New patients, new problems, the ongoing business of a floor that doesn't stop because something extraordinary happened in one corner of it. Audra found the N95 masks she had dropped when the helicopters came. They were on the floor near the supply cart, slightly scuffed, scattered in the small radius of someone who had set something down quickly and not thought about it again. She crouched, collected them, straightened, and stood under the fluorescent lights with the masks in her hand and the supply cart to her left and the trauma bay around her in its familiar late-night configuration. The knee ached. It would need ice and elevation before she slept, which was the same thing it needed most nights, the same negotiation she had made with her own body for 2 years. The Afghanistan memory, the specific one, the mountain, the dark, the cold was present, the way it was often present, not sharp, not overwhelming, just there, the way a scar is there when you press on it, and there when you don't. She was not going to be free of it by morning. She was not going to be free of it at any point she could currently foresee, and she had made a kind of peace with that fact that was not happiness but was sustainable. What she noticed standing there was that she was not trying to make herself small. She was not calculating angles from which she could not be seen. The fluorescent light was landing on her the same way it landed on everyone else in the room, and she was letting it. Marlene came out of the nursing station. "Administration will want a follow-up meeting," she said. "Probably early next week." She looked at Audra with the direct assessing eye of someone who is still in the process of revising a long-held position. "They're also going to want to discuss your contract. Desmond recommended a permanent placement if you want it." Audra set the N95 masks in the supply cart, aligned them in the tray the way she always aligned them. "I'm on shift until 6, she said. "Someone needs to clean the bay that was used tonight. It's still not back to standard." Marlene looked at her for a moment, not with the old expression, not yet with a new one, something in between. "I'll have someone. I'll do it," Audra said, and the way she said it made it clear that this was not self-deprecation and not punishment. It was just the next thing that needed to be done, and she was here, and she was the person who did the things that needed to be done. Marlene nodded. She turned to go back to the station, and then stopped her hand on the counter, her back still to Audra. She didn't turn around. "You should have had the tube kit," she said, "the first time you asked." It was the closest Marlene Baird had ever come in 20 years of running a trauma floor to saying she had been wrong about something. Audra understood it for exactly what it was. "No one died," Audra said, which was the only metric that had ever really mattered. Colin found her 20 minutes later, wiping down the bay surfaces with the methodical attention she brought to everything, working from the top of each station to the bottom. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he came in, as though deciding whether what he had to say was worth the interruption. "I didn't know what you were," he said finally. "I mean, I knew you were a float nurse. That's all I knew. When you placed that line earlier tonight, the one I couldn't get." He stopped, organized his thought differently. "I told myself you'd probably just gotten lucky," which is a thing people tell themselves when they don't want to update their assessment of someone. Audra moved the cloth to the next surface. "You're good with patience," she said. "The kid with the broken wrist tonight, you were good with him. That's not nothing." Colin was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to be better at paying attention," he said, "to who's in the room, to what they actually know." He said it like a commitment, not an apology, which was the version that would actually stick. He left her to finish the cleaning. She worked through the rest of the bay, in the particular quiet of a place that is settling back into itself. By the time she was done, the bay looked the way it always looked, clean, ordered, ready for whatever came through the doors next. She stripped off her gloves, washed her hands at the station sink, quickly this time, functional rather than ritual, and dried them on a paper towel. The badge Rhett had left on the instrument room sink was in the pocket of her scrub top. She had picked it up on the way out of that room, not because she had decided anything about it, but because leaving it there felt like another form of pretending. Pretending she hadn't already understood what it meant. Pretending she could keep the two versions of herself in separate rooms indefinitely. She didn't put it on. But she didn't put it anywhere else either. It stayed in her pocket, which felt like the honest position, not displayed, not discarded, just present the way the knee was present, and the memory was present, and the 6 years were present. Things that were hers, that had always been hers, that she had spent 2 years trying to leave in a room she had locked from the outside. Near the end of the shift, she passed the nursing station, where 3 of the night staff were charting. They looked up when she walked by, not with the incurious glance they had given her on every previous shift. The look that slides past float nurses, the way it slides past furniture, but with the particular attention of people who are still processing something and are not yet done. Audra met the looks without shortening her stride, or looking away, and she kept walking. At the supply cart by the entrance, she stopped and adjusted the N95 masks she had put back earlier, shifting the tray by half an inch so it sat flush with the shelf edge. A habit. The kind of small, careful action that kept spaces functional for the next person who needed them. Marlene passed behind her. Administration confirmed the follow-up for Tuesday, she said. 8 in the morning. I'll be here, Audra said. She looked down at the supply cart she had been restocking when the windows first rattled and the night changed. The gloves were fully stocked. The tray was aligned. Everything was in order. She thought about what Rhett had said in the instrument room you were Beacon the second you walked out from that wall. And she thought about the fact that she had not walked out to become Beacon again. She had walked out because Carter was dying, and she was the person who knew how to stop it. And those two facts had been in that moment the only facts that mattered. That was still true. It would probably always be true. And she was no longer certain that it was something to escape from. She turned off the supply cart light and picked up her badge lanyard from the hook where she had hung it at the start of the shift. Her Mercy General ID faced outward the way it always did. She put it around her neck. She had a bay to check on before she handed off, and then she had a drive home and an ice pack and whatever came after that. The fluorescent lights hummed at their usual frequency. The trauma bay was clean and ready. Somewhere 2 floors up, Carter Duvall was in a recovery room with a surgical team's work holding him together. And somewhere in the pocket of a float nurse's scrub top, a dented unit badge sat quietly against her hip, not worn, not discarded, just carried. Audra Keegan walked back into the trauma bay, picked up the clipboard for her final round, and went to work. There's something this story keeps coming back to, and it's this: we decide very quickly what a person is worth based on what they're holding when we meet them. A supply cart, a mop, a temporary badge, and we build entire systems around that first impression. Who gets the equipment? Who gets the questions? Who gets to touch what matters? Marlene wasn't cruel. She was efficient. She had a category for float nurses, and Audra fit the category, and the category meant something to the way she ran her floor. The problem wasn't the system. The problem was what the system missed, what it always misses. The 6 years behind the scrubs, the mountain, the 3 people she couldn't save and the hundreds she did, the left knee that still aches on cold nights, and the call sign that a team of soldiers flew across state lines to find. Audra didn't step out of that corner to prove something. She stepped out because a man was dying, and she was the only person in the room who knew how to stop it. That's not heroism in the cinematic sense. That's just someone finally stopping the argument between who they were and who they were pretending to be for long enough to do what needed to be done. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with. Not every wound heals clean. Not every person who carries something heavy is going to tell you about it. But that doesn't mean they aren't carrying it, and it doesn't mean what they carry isn't exactly what the moment needs. The person restocking the supply cart might be the most important person in the room. You just have to be paying attention. If this story stayed with you, I'd love for you to share it with someone who needs to hear it today, maybe someone who's been underestimated, or someone who's been doing the underestimating without realizing it. And if you haven't already, subscribing to the channel takes about 2 seconds and means you won't miss the next one. These stories exist because you keep showing up for them. Thank you for that.